The 43 bus crawled through Chicago's congested arteries, swallowing exhaust and afternoon heat in equal measure. Late sun sliced through smudged windows, casting long shadows across weathered faces that had learned the urban art of calculated indifference. The engine's rhythmic hum mixed with occasional phone chimes, creating a soundtrack of metropolitan detachment where strangers preferred to remain exactly that. Deshawn Carter guided the massive vehicle with practiced precision, his hands steady on the wheel after 6 years navigating this same route through the South Side. He'd mastered the delicate balance of urban bus driving. Keep your eyes forward, your mind elsewhere, and your involvement minimal. The less he saw, the less he had to deal with. Today felt no different. Just another Wednesday ferrying anonymous passengers who existed in their own bubbles of silence and smartphone screens. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Vermont and 7th coming up, he called out mechanically, not bothering to check if anyone was listening. His voice carried the flat tone of routine, worn smooth by thousands of identical announcements. Near the front, Walter Jake Anderson gripped his walking cane with white knuckles as the bus lurched to a stop. Pain shot through his right knee, the bad one, the one that still carried shrapnel from a firefight in a jungle whose name most Americans could no longer pronounce. His Vietnam veteran's cap sat low on his weathered face, faded like the memories most people had of that war, like the recognition in younger people's eyes when he wore it. Jake had his routines, the 3:45 bus to the VA clinic on Thursdays, the 4:30 bus back to his one-bedroom apartment where silence waited. But today was Wednesday, and today he was headed somewhere that required more strength than any doctor's visit. His buddy Mike's funeral, another flag-draped coffin, another gathering where the crowd got smaller each time, where handshakes felt more like farewells than greetings. 3 seats behind Walt, Erica Mendoza scrolled through patient files on her phone, 12 hours into what should have been an 8-hour nursing shift. Her blue scrubs felt like sandpaper against skin that had forgotten what rest meant. Dark circles framed eyes that had seen too much suffering for someone only 34 years old. She sipped lukewarm coffee from a paper cup, her free hand unconsciously rubbing her temple where a headache was building. The bus shuddered to another stop, hydraulics hissing like a tired sigh. More passengers climbed aboard. A construction worker with paint-stained jeans, 2 teenagers sharing earbuds, an elderly woman clutching a grocery bag. Each found their space in the unspoken choreography of public transportation, maintaining that careful distance that city dwellers perfected over years of practice. In the back corner, Steven Seagal sat with the stillness of deep water. His presence was unremarkable by design. Simple jeans, worn leather jacket, baseball cap pulled low. At 68, he'd learned the art of blending into urban crowds, of becoming invisible when invisibility served his purposes. His hands rested calmly in his lap, but his eyes missed nothing. Years of military training followed by decades in the entertainment industry had given him an unusual perspective on human nature. He could read a room the way others read books. The bus pulled away from the curb, merging into traffic that moved like cold honey. Seagal watched the other passengers with quiet interest, the nurse who was clearly exhausted but still caring enough to help others. The bus driver who'd built walls to protect himself from the chaos he witnessed daily, and especially the elderly veteran in the front, whose posture spoke of old pain and older pride. Jake stared out the window at familiar streets that had changed beyond recognition. Buildings he remembered from his youth had been torn down and replaced with glass and steel that reflected nothing but today's hurried ambitions. Sometimes he felt like a ghost haunting his own city, carrying memories of people and places that existed nowhere but in the fading photographs of his mind. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial Service was scheduled for 3 o'clock at Graceland Cemetery. Mike Desmond, Specialist 25th Infantry Division, had finally succumbed to the cancer that Agent Orange had planted in his lungs decades ago. They'd served together in the Central Highlands, shared foxholes and fears, and the kind of brotherhood that only forms when death is a constant companion. Now Jake was one of the few left to remember Mike's laugh, the way he'd hum Motown songs while cleaning his rifle, how he'd saved Jake's life during that ambush near Pliku. The memorial would be small, maybe 8 or 10 guys, all of them pushing 80, all of them carrying invisible wounds that never quite healed. They'd stand around Mike's grave, salute the flag, and promise to remember. Then they'd go home, to empty apartments and prescription bottles, counting down the days until someone would be standing at their own graveside, making the same promises. Erica glanced up from her phone, noticing the veteran for the first time. Something about his stillness caught her attention, not the relaxed stillness of someone at peace, but the tense stillness of someone holding something heavy. She'd seen that look before in her hospital patients, especially the older ones who'd lived through wars and losses that had no easy names. The bus hit a pothole, jarring everyone slightly. Jake winced, his hand tightening on his cane. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but Seagal noticed it. He'd been watching the old soldier with growing respect, recognizing something familiar in his bearing, the particular way veterans carried themselves even decades after their service ended. "Ashland Avenue, next stop," Deshawn announced, his voice cutting through the white noise of urban travel. The bus began to slow, hydraulics whining as they approached another cluster of waiting passengers. Among them, a young man in expensive sneakers and gold chains checked his reflection in his phone's camera, adjusting his angles for maximum intimidation factor. Marcus T-Rex Rivera had been planning this moment all morning. He'd mapped out the route, studied the timing, chosen this particular bus because he knew it would be crowded enough to provide an audience, but contained enough to prevent easy escape. His Instagram followers were hungry for content and controversial. Content paid the bills. He'd built his reputation on public confrontations, on finding the right targets and pushing them until they broke or backed down. Today he was looking for something special, something that would go viral, that would cement his reputation as someone not to be messed with. He'd noticed the old man with the military cap through the window. Perfect. Veterans were always good for reactions, especially the old ones who still believed in respect and honor and all those outdated concepts that his generation had moved past. As the bus doors opened with a mechanical wheeze, Marcus stepped aboard with the swagger of someone who owned every room he entered. His eyes immediately began scanning for opportunity, for weakness, for the perfect moment to create content that would trend by dinner time. The peaceful commute was about to become something else entirely. Marcus Rivera stepped onto the bus like he was walking onto a stage, which in his mind, he was. Every public space was a potential backdrop for content, every stranger a possible, supporting character in his personal drama of street credibility. At 22, he'd mastered the art of manufactured confrontation, turning public humiliation into profit through carefully orchestrated social media stunts that fed his growing following of viewers hungry for chaos. His gold chains caught the afternoon light streaming through the bus windows, each piece carefully chosen to project wealth and menace in equal measure. The Jordans on his feet cost more than most people's monthly rent, pristine white leather that had never seen actual work. Everything about his appearance was calculated, from the designer jeans that hung just right to the way he held his phone, always ready to capture the next viral moment. "Damn, it's crowded in here," he announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying the forced confidence of someone who needed the world to notice him. Several passengers glanced up from their phones, then quickly looked away. They recognized the type, young, loud, looking for trouble, better to stay invisible. But Marcus wasn't interested in the passengers who tried to disappear. His eyes swept the bus with predatory efficiency, cataloging potential targets. The tired nurse was too alert, too ready to push back. The construction worker looked like he might actually fight. The teenagers were his own generation, no sport in that. Then he saw Jake Anderson. The old man sat near the front, shoulders slightly hunched, military cap pulled low over weathered features. His hands rested on a walking cane, knuckles prominent through thin skin. Everything about him screamed vulnerability, the careful way he held himself, the defensive posture, the visible frailty that came with age and old injuries. Perfect. Marcus felt the familiar rush of opportunity. Old veterans were ideal targets for his brand of performance art. They'd been trained to take abuse, to follow orders, to respect authority even when authority didn't respect them back. They rarely fought back physically, too old, too slow, too conditioned by decades of being told their sacrifices didn't matter. And the audience always ate it up. Half would be outraged, half would be entertained, and both reactions translated into views, shares, and ultimately money. He pulled out his phone, checking the camera angle and lighting. The bus's windows provided decent natural light, and the crowded setting would make the confrontation feel more intimate, more real. His followers preferred authenticity, or at least the appearance of it. "Yo, check out Grandpa up there," Marcus said, loud enough for half the bus to hear. He held his phone at chest level, recording as he spoke, looking all sad and shit. With that little hat, probably crying about some war nobody gives a fuck about anymore. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Erica Mendoza looked up from her patient files, her expression darkening as she realized what was happening. Jake's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, but he kept staring out the window, his jaw set in a hard line. The lack of reaction only encouraged Marcus. He'd learned that silent targets required more pressure before they broke, but they also provided the most satisfying content when they finally snapped. The quiet dignity crumbling under sustained attack always played well with his audience. "Bet he's got some stories," Marcus continued, moving closer to Jake's seat. "Stories about how he used to be somebody, how people used to thank him for his service and shit. Now look at him. Just another broke-ass old man riding the bus because nobody gives a damn about him anymore." Jake's knuckles went white where they gripped his cane. A muscle in his jaw twitched, but he maintained his silence. He'd learned long ago that engaging with bullies only fed their hunger. Better to endure, to wait it out, to preserve what dignity he could until the moment passed. But Marcus had no intention of letting the moment pass. He'd invested too much time in this setup, and his audience was counting on him to deliver. He could almost see the comments rolling in, the flame emojis, the savage reactions, the shares that would push his video into viral territory. "What's that hat supposed to mean anyway?" Marcus asked, his voice dripping with mock curiosity. "Vietnam? Shit, that was like 50 years ago. Ancient history, old man. Time to move on." Several passengers were now openly staring, though none made any move to intervene. Deshawn Carter watched in his rearview mirror, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. He'd seen confrontations before and knew how quickly they could escalate. But company policy was clear. Keep driving. Don't get involved. Let the passengers sort out their own problems. His job was to transport people, not police them. "Matter of fact," Marcus continued, warming to his performance, "what did you even do over there? Kill some farmers, burn down some villages? Real heroic shit, right? That's what you're all proud of?" The words hit Jake like physical blows. Memories he'd spent decades trying to bury clawed their way to the surface. The faces of friends who never came home. The impossible choices made by teenagers in a jungle hell. The protests and spit and accusations that had welcomed them back to a country that seemed ashamed of their sacrifice. Erica found herself gripping her phone, her thumb hovering over the camera app. Part of her wanted to intervene, to tell this punk to leave the old man alone, but another part was afraid. Afraid of becoming the next target. Afraid of escalating the situation. Afraid of the violence that seemed to crackle in the air around Marcus like static electricity. In the back of the bus, Steven Seagal continued to watch with the patience of a predator. His expression hadn't changed, but something behind his eyes had shifted from passive observation to active assessment. He'd seen bullies before, in schoolyards and movie sets, in military bases and foreign countries where American tourists thought they could treat locals however they pleased. The pattern was always the same. Pick the weakest target, apply, pressure until they break, feed off the humiliation and fear. Most bullies were cowards at heart, but they were also dangerous, desperate for validation, willing to escalate situations far beyond common sense, capable of real cruelty when they found the right victim. This one was particularly toxic, young enough to think he was invincible, media savvy enough to monetize his cruelty, surrounded by an audience that provided both shield and encouragement. Marcus leaned in closer to Jake, close enough that the old man could smell his cologne and the mint gum he was chewing. "You hearing me, Grandpa? Or are you too deaf from all them bombs going off? Maybe that's why you need the cane. Got your legs blown off by some kid with an AK?" Jake's breathing quickened slightly, but he maintained his silence. Inside, he was 17 again, crouched in a foxhole while mortars fell like deadly rain. He was 19, watching his best friend die in his arms while helicopters circled overhead. He was 21, stepping off a plane at LAX to face protesters who'd called him baby killer and spat at his uniform. The bus hit another pothole, causing several passengers to sway in their seats. The motion brought Marcus even closer to Jake, close enough to invade his personal space completely. The old veteran's breathing became more labored, his left hand beginning to tremble slightly where it rested on his knee. "Aw, look at that," Marcus said with exaggerated sympathy, pointing, his phone at Jake's shaking hand. "Old boy's having some kind of episode. Post-traumatic stress disorder? That what they calling it now when soldiers can't handle their business?" The cruelty in his voice was casual, conversational, which somehow made it worse. He wasn't angry or passionate, he was simply enjoying himself, feeding off Jake's obvious distress like a parasite feeds off its host. But he'd made a mistake. In his eagerness to create viral content, Marcus had forgotten that buses carried more than just potential victims. They also carried witnesses. And in the back corner, one particular witness had seen enough. Steven Seagal began to rise from his seat with the fluid motion of someone half his age. The atmosphere on the bus shifted like weather before a storm. What had started as casual cruelty was morphing into something darker, more dangerous. Marcus Rivera, intoxicated by the power he felt over the silent veteran, pushed deeper into territory that would have warned off anyone with functioning survival instincts. "You know what I think?" Marcus said, his phone still recording as he towered over Jake's seated form. "I think all you Vietnam guys are the same. Bunch of fucking losers who couldn't cut it in a real war. Had to go fight some rice farmers with pitchforks. And you still fucking lost." Jake's breath caught in his throat. The tremor in his left hand spread up his arm, a visible manifestation of memories that refused to stay buried. In his mind, he could hear the whop, whop, whop of helicopter blades, smell cordite and jungle rot, and the metallic scent of blood. He could see Mikey Desmond's face, 19 years old and grinning, making jokes about the girl he was going to marry when they got home from this godforsaken place. Mikey, who'd taken shrapnel to the chest during the Tet Offensive. Mikey, who'd died holding Jake's hand while calling for his mother. Mikey, whose funeral Jake was trying to reach before this nightmare started. "Cat got your tongue, old man?" Marcus pressed, leaning down so his face was only inches from Jake's. "Or maybe you're just embarrassed. Embarrassed that you fought in the most unpopular war in American history. Embarrassed that everybody back home knew you were fighting for nothing." Several passengers had pulled out their own phones now, some recording the confrontation, others apparently ready to call for help if things escalated further. The teenage girls who'd been sharing earbuds had stopped their music, watching with the horrified fascination that car accidents inspire. The construction worker was gripping his lunchbox like he might need to use it as a weapon. Deshawn Carter's eyes flicked between the road and his rearview mirror with increasing frequency. Traffic was heavy, limiting his options for pulling over or reaching a police station quickly. His radio crackled with dispatch chatter, but he hadn't called anything in yet. Company policy discouraged drivers from reporting passenger disputes unless violence actually occurred. But this felt different. This felt like violence was inevitable. 36th Street coming up, he announced, his voice tight with tension. Maybe the troublemaker would get off. Maybe this would resolve itself before someone got hurt. But Marcus wasn't going anywhere. He'd found his target, and he was committed to seeing this through to whatever conclusion would generate the most views. In his experience, old people broke in predictable ways. They either started crying, which was comedy gold, or they got angry and made fools of themselves, which was even better. Either way, he won. "You probably got some medals in a box somewhere," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a mock sympathetic tone. Sit around polishing them, telling yourself they meant something. But they don't, do they? Nobody cares about your service. Nobody cares about your sacrifice. You're just another forgotten old fart waiting to die. Jake's right hand clenched around his cane handle hard enough that his knuckles showed white through thin skin. The words found their target because they echoed fears he'd carried for decades. That his service had been meaningless. That his friends had died for nothing. That their country had moved on without them and preferred to forget they'd ever existed. But alongside the pain came something else. Anger. Not the hot, impulsive anger of youth, but the cold, disciplined anger of someone who'd seen real evil and learned to recognize it in all its forms. This punk, with his phone and his gold chains and his casual cruelty, represented everything Jake had spent his life fighting against. The triumph of selfishness over service, of mockery over respect, of taking without giving. In the back of the bus, Steven Seagal had risen to his full height. At 6'4", he commanded attention even when trying to blend in. But now he wasn't trying to hide anymore. His movement was deliberate, controlled, like a big cat that had decided it was time to hunt. The other passengers began to notice him, their attention splitting between the confrontation at the front and this new development at the back. There was something about his presence that changed the equation, something that suggested the balance of power was about to shift dramatically. But Marcus, focused entirely on his victim and his phone screen, remained oblivious. He was building toward his climax, preparing for the moment when the old man would finally break and give him the money shot he needed. I bet you got nightmares, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his shouting had. I bet you wake up screaming, thinking you're back in the jungle with all your dead friends. PTSD, right? That's what happens to weak-ass soldiers who can't handle the pressure. Jake's breathing became rapid and shallow. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. The bus around him began to fade as memories overwhelmed present reality. He was back in Firebase Charlie, listening to incoming rounds whistle overhead. He was watching his platoon leader step on a mine and disappear in a cloud of dirt and smoke. He was holding dying boys who should have been home playing football and dating girls, and planning futures that would never come. Look at him, Marcus said to his phone camera, panning across Jake's obviously distressed face. This is what American heroes look like, people. Broken down old men who can't even ride a bus without having a fucking breakdown. That's when Erica Mendoza made her decision. Her thumb moved to her phone's camera app, and she began recording from her position 3 seats back. If this was going to happen, if this young sociopath was going to torment a veteran for internet clout, then the world needed to see it all. Not just Marcus's edited version, but the full context of his cruelty. The bus lurched as Deshawn hit the brakes, harder than necessary at a red light. The sudden movement caused several passengers to reach for handholds, but Marcus used it as an opportunity to increase the pressure. Even the bus driver's trying to throw you around, he said with mock concern. Poor old guy can't catch a break. Maybe you should get off at the next stop. Find somewhere quiet to have your little episode where you won't embarrass yourself in front of all these people. Steven Seagal had moved halfway down the aisle now, his approach steady and silent. He'd seen enough. In military situations, there came a moment when reconnaissance ended and action began. In civilian life, that moment was usually when someone who couldn't defend themselves was being systematically destroyed by someone who could. The veteran's distress was visible to anyone who cared to look. The rapid breathing, the trembling hands, the 1,000-yard stare that suggested he was reliving horrors no 22-year-old punk could comprehend. This wasn't entertainment. This was cruelty, pure and simple, and it was escalating toward something that would leave permanent damage. Marcus pulled out a second phone, apparently deciding he needed multiple angles for this particular performance. Yo, everybody check this out, he said, loud enough for the entire bus to hear. We got ourselves a genuine American war hero here, and he's about to show us what that really means. He reached toward Jake's cap, apparently intending to snatch it off his head for the camera. Let's see what's under this little hat of yours, old man. Let's see what a real... That's when Steven Seagal's voice cut through the bus like a blade, through silk. "Son, I think that's enough." The voice that filled the bus carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Every conversation stopped, every phone lowered. Even Marcus Rivera paused mid-reach, his hand frozen inches from Jake Anderson's cap as he turned to see who had dared interrupt his performance. Steven Seagal stood in the aisle, balanced perfectly despite the bus's swaying motion. His presence filled the space around him, not through noise or bluster, but through the kind of absolute stillness that suggested barely contained power. At 68, he moved like a man half his age, every step deliberate and controlled. "Who the fuck are you?" Marcus demanded, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before. Something about the older man's bearing set off alarm bells in the primitive part of his brain that had kept his ancestors alive in more dangerous times. "Someone who thinks you should leave this gentleman alone," Seagal replied calmly. His voice never rose above conversational level, but it carried to every corner of the bus. "He's done nothing to deserve your attention." Marcus felt the eyes of every passenger on him now. This wasn't the script he'd written. In his scenarios, he was always the predator, always in control, always the one dictating terms. The appearance of this unexpected player threatened to turn his carefully orchestrated performance into something unpredictable and potentially dangerous. But backing down wasn't an option, not with his phone recording, not with his reputation on the line. His followers expected him to dominate every situation, to never show weakness or uncertainty. Retreat would be worse than failure. It would be brand suicide. "Mind your own fucking business, old man," Marcus snapped, trying to reclaim control of the narrative. "This ain't got nothing to do with you." "Actually, it does," Seagal said, taking another step forward. "See, I was in the service myself. Marines, then Navy SEALs, and we had a saying, 'You don't abandon your brothers.' That gentleman there is my brother, even though we've never met." The words hit the bus like a physical force. Several passengers straightened in their seats, suddenly understanding that they were witnessing something significant. Jake Anderson looked up for the first time since the harassment began, his eyes focusing on the tall figure moving toward him with deliberate purpose. Marcus felt the momentum slipping away from him. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. His victims were supposed to be isolated, helpless, without allies or advocates. The appearance of someone willing to stand up to him threatened everything he'd built his persona around. "I don't give a shit what you used to be," Marcus said, but his voice carried less conviction now. "That was then, this is now, and right. Now you need to sit your old ass down before something happens to you." Seagal smiled, and somehow that was more unsettling than anger would have been. "Something like what, son?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Around them, the bus had become completely silent except for the hum of the engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. Every passenger was holding their breath, sensing they were about to witness either justice or catastrophe. Marcus had built his reputation on reading situations, on knowing when to push and when to retreat, on finding the exact pressure points that would break his targets without putting himself at real risk. But this situation was outside his experience. The older man showed no fear, no uncertainty, no indication that he could be intimidated or manipulated. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead, Seagal radiated the kind of confidence that came from decades of real training and real experience, not the manufactured toughness of social media, but the authentic strength of someone who'd faced genuine danger and survived through skill and discipline rather than luck. "You don't know who you're fucking with," Marcus said, his voice rising, as desperation began to creep in. "I got followers, man. I got people who watch my back. You put your hands on me, there's gonna be consequences." "I'm not going to put my hands on you," Seagal replied evenly. "You're going to apologize to this gentleman, sit down quietly, and ride the rest of this bus in silence, because you're embarrassing yourself, and more importantly, you're disrespecting someone who deserves better." Jake Anderson felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time in longer than he could remember, someone was standing up for him. not out of pity or obligation, but out of genuine respect for what he represented. The trembling in his hands began to subside as strength flowed back into him. "Fuck that," Marcus spat. "I ain't apologizing to nobody, and I sure as hell ain't taking orders from some washed-up has-been who thinks he's still tough because he watched some war movies." The insult was calculated to provoke a reaction, to force Seagal into doing something that would give Marcus grounds to claim victimhood. But Seagal didn't take the bait. Instead, he took one more step forward, closing the distance between them, to arm's length. "This is your last chance to walk away from this with your dignity intact," Seagal said quietly. "I'm asking you nicely to leave this man alone and find your seat. Don't make me ask less nicely." Marcus felt trapped. Behind him sat the veteran he'd been tormenting, whose distress was now giving way to something that looked almost like hope. In front of him stood a man who radiated danger despite his calm demeanor. Around him, passengers were recording everything, their phones capturing every word and gesture for posterity. His options were limited and all of them were bad. He could back down, which would destroy his credibility with his followers. He could escalate, which might give him content, but also might result in him getting hurt. Or he could try to find a middle path that let him save face while extracting himself from the situation. But Marcus Rivera had never been good at middle paths. His entire brand was built on extremes, on pushing situations past their breaking point for the entertainment of people who lived vicariously through his aggression. Moderation was foreign to him, compromise an alien concept. So he made the worst possible choice. "You want to protect Grandpa here?" Marcus said, raising his phone to capture Seagal's face. "Fine, but first you're gonna have to go through me." He shoved his phone toward Seagal's face, apparently trying to provoke him into striking the camera. It was a common tactic: force your opponent to either damage expensive equipment or look weak on video. Either outcome could be spun to his advantage. But Steven Seagal had been dealing with aggressive people longer than Marcus had been alive. His response was so smooth, so effortless, that most passengers missed it entirely. One moment Marcus was thrusting his phone forward. The next moment he was stumbling backward as his wrist was twisted in a grip that felt like it could snap bone. "I asked you nicely," Seagal said, his voice still calm as he applied just enough pressure to Marcus's wrist to make his point without causing permanent damage. "Now I'm telling you, leave him alone." Marcus dropped his phone, the device clattering to the floor as pain shot up his arm. For the first time since boarding the bus, his mask of arrogant confidence cracked completely. He found himself looking into eyes that had seen real violence, real consequences, real stakes higher than social media metrics. "You're hurting me," he gasped, his free hand clawing at Seagal's grip. "No," Seagal replied matter-of-factly. "I'm controlling you. If I wanted to hurt you, you'd know the difference." Around them, the bus remained frozen in time. Passengers watched with expressions ranging from shock to satisfaction to fear. Deshawn Carter had pulled over to the curb, his hand hovering over the radio, unsure whether to call for police, paramedics, or backup. And in the front seat, Jake Anderson sat straighter than he had in years, watching as someone finally stood up for what was right, finally said enough was enough, finally drew a line that bullies couldn't cross without consequences. The breaking point had arrived. What happened next would determine whether this remained just another forgotten incident on Chicago public transportation, or whether it became something much larger. A moment that reminded everyone watching that dignity still mattered, that respect was still worth fighting for, and that sometimes the quiet heroes were the most dangerous ones of all. The silence on the bus stretched like a taut wire, broken only by Marcus Rivera's labored breathing and the distant hum of Chicago traffic. Steven Seagal maintained his grip on the young man's wrist with surgical precision. Enough pressure to command absolute attention, not enough to cause lasting damage. It was a masterclass in controlled force, the kind of restraint that separated trained professionals from street thugs. "Here's what's going to happen," Seagal said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd negotiated with terrorists and dictators. "You're going to pick up your phone, you're going to apologize to this gentleman, and then you're going to find your seat and stay there until your stop comes up. Not if you understand." Marcus's eyes darted around the bus, searching for allies, witnesses, anything that might shift the balance back in his favor. But the faces staring back at him offered no support. The construction worker looked disgusted. The teenage girls seemed horrified. Even the passengers who'd been recording with their phones had lowered their devices, apparently recognizing that this had moved beyond entertainment into something more serious. "You can't just grab people," Marcus gasped, trying to inject indignation into his voice. "This is assault, man. I got rights." "You absolutely do," Seagal agreed readily. "Just like this veteran has the right to ride public transportation without being harassed by someone young enough to be his grandson. Just like everyone else on this bus has the right to travel in peace without being subjected to your performance." Jake Anderson watched the exchange with growing amazement. In all his years, through the war, through the protests, through decades of being invisible or worse, no one had ever stood up for him like this. The strength flowing into him wasn't just relief, it was validation. Someone finally understood that his service meant something, that he deserved respect simply for being human. Marcus tried to twist his wrist free, but Seagal's grip was immovable. Years of martial arts training had taught him how to control an opponent's movement with minimal effort, how to use leverage and pressure points to render resistance futile. Marcus might as well have been trying to arm wrestle a statue. "Let me go, old man," Marcus demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "I got followers watching. They're gonna see this. They're gonna know you put your hands on me first." "Actually," Erica Mendoza spoke up from her seat, holding up her phone, "they're going to see the whole thing, including the part where you tormented a veteran for 5 minutes before this gentleman stepped in." Marcus's head snapped toward her, his eyes widening as he realized the implications. His carefully crafted narrative was collapsing. Instead of footage of him dominating a weak target, the internet would see him being controlled by someone he'd tried to intimidate. "You been recording?" he asked, his voice suddenly small. "Everything," Erica confirmed. "From the moment you started harassing Mr. She looked toward Jake questioningly. "Anderson," Jake said quietly. "Jake Anderson, 25th Infantry Division." "Mr. Anderson," Erica continued, "the whole thing's on video. Your followers are going to see exactly what kind of person you really are." Seagal felt the fight go out of Marcus like air from a punctured balloon. The young man's shoulders sagged as the reality of his situation hit him. His reputation, his brand, his entire online persona was about to be destroyed by his own actions captured on someone else's camera. "Pick up your phone," Seagal said, gradually releasing the pressure on Marcus's wrist. Slowly. Marcus bent down and retrieved his device with shaking hands. The screen was cracked but still functional. He stared at it like it had betrayed him, which in a way it had. The tool he'd used to build his following was about to become the instrument of his downfall. "Now," Seagal continued, "apologize to Mr. Anderson. Mean it." Marcus looked between Seagal's implacable face and Jake's weathered features. For the first time since boarding the bus, he seemed to actually see the veteran as a human being, rather than a prop for his performance. The lines around Jake's eyes spoke of pain and loss and endurance. The careful way he held himself suggested old injuries that still ached. The dignity with which he'd absorbed the abuse spoke to a strength that Marcus was only beginning to understand. Marcus started, then stopped. The words felt foreign in his mouth. "I'm sorry, Mr. Anderson, I was wrong, way wrong. You didn't deserve any of that shit." Jake studied the young man's face, looking for sincerity behind the fear and humiliation. What he found surprised him. Genuine remorse, the dawning realization of how cruel he'd been, the beginning of something that might eventually become wisdom. "Apology accepted," Jake said simply. Marcus blinked in surprise. He'd expected anger, demands for further humiliation, anything but simple grace. The veteran's response hit him harder than any punishment could have. "Thank you," Marcus whispered, and for the first time, it sounded like he meant it. Seagal stepped back, giving Marcus room to move. "Now find your seat and think about what just happened here. Think about what you learned." Marcus nodded numbly and stumbled toward an empty seat near the back, his swagger completely gone. He slumped down and stared at his hands, his phone forgotten on his lap. The other passengers watched him with expressions ranging from pity to satisfaction, but no one spoke. Deshawn Carter, who'd been watching the entire exchange in his rearview mirror, finally keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Bus 43. Had a situation. On board, but it's resolved now. Continuing route." "Copy that, 43. Everything okay?" Deshawn looked back at his passengers, the humbled bully, the vindicated veteran, the quietly satisfied nurse, and the martial artist who'd diffused a potentially explosive situation without throwing a single punch. "Yeah," he said. "Everything's okay now." As the bus pulled back into traffic, Jake Anderson felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice. Someone had seen his worth, had stood up for his dignity, had reminded everyone present that respect wasn't earned through intimidation but through service, sacrifice, and simple human decency. Seagal returned to his seat without fanfare, becoming unremarkable again through sheer force of will. But the other passengers continued to glance at him with newfound respect. They'd witnessed something rare in modern urban life. Someone willing to intervene, to put themselves at risk for a stranger, to stand up for what was right simply because it was right. The confrontation was over, but its effects would ripple outward in ways none of them could yet imagine. The remaining miles to Marcus Rivera's stop felt like hours instead of minutes. He sat hunched in his seat, staring at his cracked phone screen while the weight of his actions settled on his shoulders like lead. The adrenaline that had fueled his performance was gone, replaced by a sick feeling in his stomach that he couldn't shake. Around him, he could feel the other passengers' eyes, not the admiring glances he'd grown accustomed to when his stunts went viral, but something else entirely. Disappointment, disgust, pity. The construction worker shook his head every time he looked in Marcus's direction. The teenage girls whispered to each other, occasionally pointing at him with expressions of revulsion. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Rivera was experiencing shame. His phone buzzed with notifications. Comments were already pouring in on the video he'd been live streaming before Seagal intervened. But these weren't the supportive emojis and savage reactions he usually received. These were different. "Yo, T-Rex, what the hell, man? That's somebody's grandpa. This ain't it, bro. Delete this shit. Imagine being such a loser you gotta pick on old people for views. My grandfather served in Vietnam. This is fucked up. Unsubscribed. You're trash." The comments kept coming, each one a small knife twisting in his chest. His follower count, which he checked obsessively throughout the day, was dropping in real time. Hundreds, then thousands of people were abandoning him, their usernames disappearing from his feed like rats fleeing a sinking ship. But it wasn't just the numbers that bothered him. It was the realization that these people, his audience, his validation, his entire reason for existing, had only been following him to watch him hurt others. They'd never actually respected him or admired him. They'd just been entertained by his cruelty, and now that the entertainment had turned ugly, they were moving on to the next spectacle. 3 seats ahead, Jake Anderson sat straighter than he had in months. The confrontation had drained him emotionally, but it had also awakened something he'd thought was gone forever, a sense of his own worth. For too long, he'd internalized the message that his service didn't matter, that his generation of veterans were embarrassments to be forgotten. Seeing someone stand up for him had reminded him that he had value, that his sacrifices meant something. Steven Seagal remained in his corner seat, outwardly calm but inwardly processing what had just occurred. He'd dealt with bullies before, in dojos, on movie sets, in countries where American diplomats faced real threats. The pattern was always the same. They were strongest when unopposed, but they crumbled quickly when faced with genuine resistance. This kid, because that's all Marcus really was, a confused kid, had built his entire identity around a lie. He'd confused fear with respect, submission with admiration. But real strength, the kind that mattered, came from protecting others, not exploiting them. It came from service, not self-promotion. Erica Mendoza was still recording intermittently, documenting the aftermath as much as the confrontation itself. As a nurse, she'd seen how trauma affected people, how some experiences left permanent marks while others became catalysts for growth. She had a feeling that this bus ride would fall into the latter category for most of the people involved. Her phone showed that her video already had hundreds of views, with more pouring in every minute. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive of both Jake and Seagal, with many viewers sharing their own stories about veterans they'd known and loved. What had started as documentation was becoming something larger, a conversation about respect, dignity, and the courage to intervene when others needed help. Marcus's stop was approaching. Through the window, he could see the familiar street corner where he usually met his crew, where they'd plan their next stunt or count their earnings from the previous day's content. But the thought of facing them now, of explaining what had happened, made his stomach churn. His phone rang. It was his boy Trey, probably calling to congratulate him on whatever had gone viral this time. Marcus stared at the screen, unable to bring himself to answer. How could he explain that he'd been humiliated by an old man, that his carefully constructed image had crumbled in minutes, that he was beginning to question everything he'd built his life around? The bus began to slow. "Halstead and Division," Deshawn called out. Marcus stood on unsteady legs, his gold chains feeling heavier than they ever had before. As he walked toward the front of the bus, he passed Jake Anderson's seat. The old veteran looked up at him with eyes that held no anger, no triumph, just a quiet sadness that somehow hurt worse than rage would have. "Mr. Anderson," Marcus said quietly, stopping beside the seat. I really am sorry. What I did was wrong. You didn't deserve any of that." Jake studied the young man's face. "We all make mistakes, son. Question is what we learn from them." "Yeah," Marcus nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out." He continued toward the exit, pausing briefly next to Steven Seagal's seat. The older man looked up at him with calm, measuring eyes. "What you did back there," Marcus said, standing up for him. "That took real strength, real courage. I thought I was strong, but I was just a bully." "Strength isn't about who you can tear down," Seagal replied quietly. "It's about who you're willing to build up. Remember that." Marcus nodded, unable to trust his voice. The bus doors opened with a mechanical wheeze, and he stepped out onto the sidewalk. As the bus pulled away, he stood on the corner watching it disappear into Chicago traffic, carrying with it the last remnants of the person he used to be. His phone buzzed again. More comments, more notifications, more evidence of his fall from whatever grace he'd imagined he possessed. But for the first time in years, Marcus Rivera wasn't looking at his phone. He was looking at his reflection in a storefront window, seeing himself clearly for perhaps the first time in his adult life. What he saw wasn't a social media influencer or a street legend or any of the other identities he'd crafted for himself. He saw a scared, insecure young man who'd built his entire sense of self around hurting others, and who now had to figure out how to become someone worth respecting. The breaking of Marcus Rivera was complete. What remained to be seen was whether anything better could be built from the pieces. Inside the bus, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Passengers who'd been strangers were now talking quietly among themselves, processing what they'd witnessed. Several had approached Jake to thank him for his service, gestures that brought tears to the old veteran's eyes. The incident was over, but its impact was just beginning. In a few hours, Erica's video would be shared thousands of times. By tomorrow, it would be national news. By the end of the week, it would spark conversations in living rooms and classrooms across the country about respect, dignity, and the courage to stand up for what's right. But that was still to come. For now, the bus continued its route through Chicago, carrying its passengers toward their destinations with a little more hope than they'd had when the journey began. Within 3 hours of Erica Mendoza uploading the video to her social media accounts, the Chicago bus incident had exploded across the internet like digital wildfire. What started as a simple documentation of injustice had become something far larger, a cultural touchstone that sparked conversations in living rooms, newsrooms, and coffee shops across America. Erica sat in her small apartment watching the view count climb with a mixture of amazement and anxiety. She'd titled the video simply, "Veteran Harassed on Chicago Bus, Watch How One Man Stepped Up." The numbers were staggering. 50,000 views. In the first hour, 200,000 by hour 2, over 1 million by hour 3. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications, friend requests, and interview requests from news outlets she'd only seen on television. The comments section had become a river of emotion. Veterans shared their own stories of being disrespected or forgotten. Young people apologized for their generation's behavior. Parents posted pictures of family members who'd served, some who'd never made it home. What had started as documentation was becoming a national reckoning. "My grandfather fought in Korea and never talked about it," read one comment with thousands of likes. "After watching this, I called him. We talked for 2 hours. Thank you for reminding me that his silence held stories worth hearing." Another comment from a username that simply read, "Marine Mom, 2001. My son died in Afghanistan. This video made me cry, but it also made me proud. Thank you to the man who stood up for that veteran. You honored all of them." But not all the responses were supportive. Marcus Rivera's original followers were flooding the comments with defense of their fallen idol, though their numbers were dwindling by the hour. T-Rex was just having fun, some argued. Everybody's too sensitive these days. These comments were quickly buried under avalanches of responses explaining exactly why harassment wasn't entertainment. At a downtown Chicago diner called Rose's Corner, Jake Anderson sat across from Steven Seagal, both men nursing cups of coffee that had long since gone cold. They'd come here after Jake's memorial service for Mike Desmond, a simple ceremony that had taken on new meaning after the day's events. "I never expected this," Jake said, showing Seagal his phone screen. Someone had recognized them from the video and posted their location, leading to a steady stream of well-wishers approaching their table. All these years of feeling invisible, and now. "Fame's a strange thing," Seagal replied quietly. "Can be a blessing or a curse depending on how you handle it. Question is, what do you want to do with this attention?" Jake considered the question. For decades, he'd carried the weight of feeling forgotten, of believing his service hadn't mattered to anyone but the handful of brothers who'd shared the experience. Now suddenly, thousands of people were thanking him for his sacrifice, sharing stories of their own family members who'd served, expressing genuine gratitude and respect. "Maybe it's time to start talking," Jake said slowly. "About Mike, about the others we lost, about what it was really like over there. Not the Hollywood version or the protest version, but the truth." Rose, the diner's owner and namesake, approached their table with fresh coffee and a warm smile. "This one's on the house," she said, refilling their cups. "Been watching the news all afternoon. What you did on that bus, both of you, that's what this neighborhood needs to see more of." "We just did what was right," Seagal said. "Exactly," Rose replied. "And nowadays, that's rarer than it should be." Across town, Marcus Rivera sat in his bedroom at his mother's house, staring at his phone with growing horror. The video of his humiliation had been shared on every major platform, often with commentary that dissected his behavior frame by frame. His follower count, which had taken him 2 years to build, had collapsed to a fraction of its former size. Worse, his real name had been discovered and shared, making him unemployable in his usual circles. But it wasn't just the social media consequences that bothered him. For the first time in his adult life, he was being forced to confront the person he'd become. The young man in that video, cruel, arrogant, feeding off an old man's pain, was that really him? Had he really built his entire identity around causing suffering for other people's entertainment? His mother, Carmen, knocked on his door. "Marcus, there's someone here to see you." He opened the door to find Pastor Williams from the community center where he'd volunteered as a teenager before social media and street cred had consumed his life. The older man's face showed disappointment, but not condemnation. "Saw the video," Pastor Williams said simply. "Thought we should talk." "I fucked up," Marcus said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I fucked up bad, Pastor. I don't even know who I am anymore. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, the pastor replied. Sometimes we need to lose ourselves before we can find who we're supposed to be. Meanwhile, at WGN Chicago's news studio, producers were scrambling to book interviews with everyone involved in the incident. The story had everything modern audiences craved: conflict, resolution, social media drama, and deeper questions about respect and values in contemporary America. "We need the veteran," said Sarah Chen, the evening news producer. "His story is the heart of this whole thing, and if we can get the man who intervened, what's his name, Steven Seagal, that would be huge." Seagal's people already said, "No," replied her assistant. They released a statement saying he won't be doing interviews. Very brief. "This isn't about me. It's about how we treat our veterans and each other." Smart, Sarah admitted. That just makes him more compelling. "What about the veteran? Anderson? His phone's been ringing nonstop. I think he's considering it." The ripple effects continued to spread. Respect Our Veterans began trending on Twitter. Facebook groups dedicated to supporting elderly veterans saw massive spikes in membership. The VFW reported hundreds of calls from young people asking how they could help local veterans in their communities. At a high school in suburban Milwaukee, a teacher used the video to spark a discussion about respect and bystander intervention in her civics class. "What would you have done?" she asked her students. "Would you have spoken up? Would you have filmed it? Would you have just looked away?" The answers revealed the complexity of the moment. Some students insisted they would have intervened immediately. Others admitted they probably would have been scared. A few recognized themselves in Marcus's behavior and expressed shame about their own past actions. "The scary part," said one student, "is how normal it seems now, like bullying people for content is just what people do. When did that become okay?" As evening fell over Chicago, the story continued to evolve and spread. News vans were positioned outside the apartment buildings where Jake and Marcus lived. Social media influencers were creating reaction videos, trying to capitalize on the trending topic. Think pieces were being written about everything from veteran care to the psychology of viral shame. But at the center of it all were real people whose lives had been fundamentally changed by a 10-minute bus ride. Jake Anderson, who'd started the day feeling invisible and forgotten, was now fielding calls from news programs and veteran organizations. Steven Seagal, who'd tried to remain anonymous, found himself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as an example of quiet heroism. Marcus Rivera, who'd built his identity around online fame, was discovering that viral infamy felt very different from viral success. The video would eventually be viewed over 50 million times across all platforms. It would inspire documentaries, news segments, academic papers, and countless conversations about respect, dignity, and moral courage. But its most important impact was yet to come, in the lives of the people who'd lived it and the choices they'd make in its aftermath. 2 weeks after the bus incident, Jake Anderson stood at a podium in the Veterans Affairs Medical Center's auditorium, looking out at an audience of nearly 300 people. Veterans from multiple conflicts sat in the front rows, their faces reflecting decades of shared understanding. Behind them were family members, community leaders, students, and citizens who'd been moved by his story to attend this impromptu speaking event. "I never wanted to be famous," Jake began, his voice carrying clearly through the room despite his nervousness. "All I wanted was to get to my friend Mike's funeral without any trouble. But sometimes life has other plans." Steven Seagal sat in the front row, having reluctantly agreed to appear at this event after dozens of requests. He'd declined every interview, every talk show invitation, every opportunity to capitalize on the viral moment. But when Jake had personally asked him to be there, to stand with him as he shared his story, Seagal couldn't refuse. "For 50 years I carried the weight of feeling like my service didn't matter," Jake continued. "Like the sacrifices my friends made were forgotten by a country that just wanted to move on and pretend we never happened. That young man on the bus, Marcus, he didn't create those feelings. He just gave voice to what I already believed about myself." In the audience, several veterans nodded in recognition. The feeling of invisibility, of being discarded by the very society they'd sworn to protect, was a common thread that connected conflicts across generations. Jake's voice grew stronger as he continued. But then something happened that I didn't expect. Someone stood up. Not because he knew me, not because he owed me anything, but because he believed I deserved respect simply for being human. And in that moment, I remembered something I'd forgotten. That service isn't about getting thanked. It's about doing what's right when it's hard to do. The applause was long and heartfelt. In the back of the room, Erica Mendoza watched with tears in her eyes. She'd been invited as the person whose video had sparked the national conversation, but she felt uncomfortable with the attention. She'd simply documented something that needed to be seen. The real heroes were the people who'd lived it. After the formal presentation, Jake was surrounded by well-wishers and fellow veterans. Stories were shared, phone numbers exchanged, promises made to stay in touch. For the first time in decades, Jake felt part of a community again, connected to something larger than his own pain and isolation. An elderly woman approached him, leaning heavily on a walker. "My husband served in Vietnam," she said quietly. "He never talked about it, never wanted recognition. After he died, I found a box of letters he'd written but never sent, to families of boys who didn't make it home. Reading them, I finally understood what he carried all those years." She pressed a folded piece of paper into Jake's hand. "This was the last one he wrote. I think he'd want you to have it." Jake unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. It was addressed to no one in particular, just to those who understand. In shaky handwriting it read, "We did our duty not for glory or gratitude, but because it was what we were called to do. If you're reading this, you understand that burden. Please know that your service mattered, your sacrifice meant something, and you are not forgotten by those who truly understand the price of freedom." 20 miles away, Marcus Rivera sat in a circle of folding chairs at the community center where Pastor Williams ran a youth outreach program. For the past week, he'd been volunteering here, helping serve meals to homeless veterans and listening to their stories. It was part of his court-ordered community service. The viral video had led to charges of harassment and disorderly conduct, but it had become something more than obligation. "Tell us about this week," Pastor Williams said, leading the group discussion for young men trying to change their lives. "I met this guy named Carlos," Marcus said slowly. "Gulf War vet, been on the streets for 3 years, lost his job, then his house, then his family, all because of PTSD that nobody wanted to help him with. And you know what? He still says, 'Thank you,' when I hand him a sandwich. Still calls me sir, even though I'm young enough to be his son." Marcus paused, struggling with emotions that were still new to him. "I spent 2 years making fun of people like him, building my rep by tearing down people who were already broken. And for what? Some likes on a video? Some followers who disappeared the minute I wasn't entertaining them anymore?" The other young men in the circle listened intently. Several of them had followed Marcus's content before his fall from grace. Now they were all trying to figure out who they wanted to be instead of who social media told them they should be. "The hardest part," Marcus continued, "is realizing that I wasn't just hurting other people. I was hurting myself. I became this character, this T-Rex persona, and I forgot who Marcus actually was underneath all that bullshit. I'm still trying to figure that out." Pastor Williams nodded approvingly. "Recovery isn't just about stopping destructive behavior. It's about rebuilding from the ground up. Who do you want to be, Marcus?" "Someone worth respecting," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Someone who builds people up instead of tearing them down. Someone my mother can be proud of again." That evening at Rose's Corner Diner, an unlikely meeting was taking place. Jake Anderson sat across from Marcus Rivera, with Steven Seagal between them as a mediator. It had been Marcus's idea to reach out, facilitated through Pastor Williams, who knew Rose and had arranged the private meeting after hours. "I wanted to apologize again," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "In person, without cameras, without anybody watching. What I did to you was unforgivable, but I'm hoping You can forgive me anyway. Jake studied the young man's face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. I forgave you on the bus, Jake said simply. The question is whether you can forgive yourself. I don't know if I should, Marcus replied. Maybe carrying this. Guilt is part of learning to be better. Guilt can teach, Seagal interjected quietly, but it can also paralyze. The goal isn't to punish yourself forever. It's to use what you've learned to become the person you were meant to be. Marcus nodded, then pulled out his phone. I want to show you something. He opened a video he'd recorded that morning at the community center. It showed him serving breakfast to homeless veterans, listening to their stories, treating them with the respect they deserved. I've been posting videos of my volunteer work, not for views or followers, but because I want people to see these guys, to understand that they matter. The video had only a few hundred views, a far cry from his previous viral content. But the comments were different. Genuine appreciation, offers to help from local organizations, messages from other young people inspired to volunteer. It's not about going viral anymore, Marcus said. It's about making a difference, even if only a few people see it. Jake reached across the table and shook Marcus's hand. That's how real change happens, son. One person at a time, one choice at a time. You keep doing that work, and you'll become the man you want to be. As they left the diner that night, each going their separate ways, the three men carried with them the knowledge that they'd been part of something larger than themselves. A moment on a city bus had sparked a national conversation, changed lives, and reminded people that dignity and respect still mattered in a world that often seemed to have forgotten both. The viral video would eventually fade from the internet's collective memory, replaced by newer controversies and fresher outrages. But its impact would continue to ripple outward through the lives it had touched, the conversations it had started, and the choices it had inspired people to make about the kind of society they wanted to live in. Sometimes change begins with the smallest act of courage, standing up when others stay seated, speaking out when others remain silent, choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier. On a crowded Chicago bus on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, three strangers had learned that lesson together, and in doing so, had reminded the rest of us that ordinary moments can become extraordinary when filled with the right choices. 6. Months after the bus incident, Marcus Rivera stood before a mirror in the community center's bathroom, adjusting the tie he'd borrowed from Pastor Williams. Today marked his first public speaking engagement since his fall from social media grace, a presentation to high school students about the dangers of online bullying and the path to redemption. His hands trembled slightly as he practiced his opening lines, not from nervousness about speaking, but from the weight of responsibility he now carried. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. After the initial shame and legal consequences, Marcus had spent weeks wallowing in self-pity and anger. He'd blamed everyone but himself, the woman who filmed him, the internet for turning against him, even Jake Anderson for being an easy target. But slowly, through countless hours of community service and painful conversations with Pastor Williams, the layers of self-deception had peeled away to reveal the frightened, insecure young man underneath. You ready for this? Pastor Williams asked, appearing in the doorway. Room's packed. Word got out that you were speaking and everybody wants to hear what you have to say. Marcus nodded, though his stomach churned with anxiety. What if they don't believe me? What if they think this is all just another performance? Then, you keep showing them through your actions, the pastor replied. Redemption isn't a one-time event, Marcus. It's a daily choice. You've been making the right choices for months now. Trust in that. In the auditorium, 300 teenagers from across Chicago's South Side waited with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity. Many recognized Marcus from his viral videos, both the ones that had made him famous and the one that had destroyed him. Some wore expressions of hostility, others seemed genuinely interested in his story. A few held signs reading, "Actions speak louder than words," and "Prove it." As Marcus walked onto the stage, he spotted familiar faces in the audience. Carlos, the Gulf War veteran he'd been working with at the homeless shelter, sat in the front row wearing a suit that the other volunteers had chipped in to buy him. Next to him sat Jake Anderson, who'd driven across town to support the young man who'd once tormented him. Even Steven Seagal was there, sitting quietly in the back corner, his presence both intimidating and reassuring. 6 months ago, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. I was somebody you probably thought you wanted to be. I had hundreds of thousands of followers, millions of views, money coming in from sponsors who wanted to be associated with my brand. I was famous for being mean, for hurting people, for finding the weakest person in any situation and destroying them for your entertainment. The room was silent, except for the soft whir of air conditioning and the distant sounds of Chicago. Traffic. Marcus had their attention, but he knew attention was fleeting. What mattered was what he did with it. I told myself I was just giving people what they wanted, that it wasn't real, that it was just content, that the people I hurt were just characters in my story. But that day on the bus, when I went after Mr. Anderson here, he gestured toward Jake. I crossed a line I didn't even know existed. And when that video went viral, when the whole world saw who I really was, I had to face the truth about what I'd become. A girl in the third row raised her hand. So you only stopped because you got caught? Marcus considered the question carefully. At first, yeah. I was angry about getting caught, embarrassed about being humiliated. But then I started doing community service and I met Carlos here. He nodded toward the veteran. And Carlos told me his story, how he served his country, came home with PTSD, lost everything, ended up on the streets. And you know what? He never stopped being kind to people. Even when the world forgot about him, even when people like me made fun of people like him, he kept his dignity. Carlos stood up slowly, his movement causing a ripple of attention through the audience. May I say something? Marcus nodded, stepping back to give the older man the microphone. When Marcus first started volunteering at our shelter, Carlos said, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness, I thought he was just there for his court-ordered hours. Another rich kid paying his dues before going back to his comfortable life. But he kept coming back even after his hours were done. He listened to our stories, really listened. He helped guys fill out VA paperwork, drove people to doctor appointments, sat with folks who just needed someone to talk to. Carlos paused, looking directly at the students. What he did on that bus was wrong, but what he's been doing since then, that's who he really is underneath all that anger and fear. People can change if they want to badly enough. The room erupted in murmurs as Carlos handed the microphone back to Marcus. Several students were wiping their eyes, moved by the veteran's words. The hardest part, Marcus continued, wasn't apologizing to Mr. Anderson or facing the legal consequences. It was looking in the mirror and admitting that I'd built my entire identity around hurting people, that the followers who loved me for being cruel weren't really my friends. They were just customers buying entertainment with my soul as the product. A boy near the back called out, So what are you doing now? How do we know you won't just go back to making viral videos when this all blows over? Marcus smiled, the first genuine expression he'd shown since taking the stage. Because I found something better than going viral. I found purpose. I run a program now that connects homeless veterans with young people who want to help. We call it Bridges, bridging the gap between generations, between service and civilian life, between being forgotten and being seen. He pulled out his phone, showing the audience a simple website with modest but meaningful statistics. 50 veterans housed, 200 volunteer hours logged, 12 young people who've changed their approach to social media after hearing our stories. It doesn't get millions of views, but it changes real lives. The questions continued for another hour. Students asked about dealing with online pressure, about finding authentic identity in a digital world, about the difference between popularity and respect. Marcus answered each one honestly, sometimes admitting he was still figuring things out himself. As the presentation ended, Jake Anderson approached the stage. The applause was respectful but reserved. These students weren't easily impressed, and they'd need to see sustained change before they fully believed in Marcus's transformation. You did good up there, Jake said, shaking Marcus's hand. Mike would have been proud. Mike, my friend whose funeral I was going to that day, he always believed people could change if they were willing to do the work. He used to say that the best apologies are the ones you make with your life, not just your words. Marcus felt tears threatening to spill over. I'm trying, Mr. Anderson. Every day I'm trying to be the man you saw in me when you forgave me. You're getting there, son. Keep walking the path. As the auditorium emptied, Marcus found himself surrounded by a small group of students who wanted to know more about the volunteer program. Among them was a girl who looked familiar, someone who'd been in several of his old viral videos, usually as a background character or unwitting participant in his pranks. I used to think you were cool, she said quietly. The way you could make people do whatever you wanted, how fearless you seemed. But watching you up there today talking about helping people instead of hurting them, that's actually cool. That takes real courage. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his small apartment updating the Bridges program website with photos from the day's volunteer activities. His social media following was a fraction of what it had been at his peak, but the engagement was different. Now, deeper, more meaningful. People shared stories of their own redemption journeys, offered to volunteer, asked genuine questions about making positive change. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. Watched the video of your presentation. Your father would be proud. You've become the man we always hoped you could be. Marcus smiled, saving the message. 6 months ago, he'd measured his worth in likes and shares and viral moments. Now he measured it in veterans housed, young people inspired, and the slow but steady rebuilding of his relationship with the people who'd never stopped loving him, even when he'd stopped loving himself. The redemption of Marcus Rivera wasn't complete, might never be complete, but it was real, built on daily choices to serve rather than exploit, to lift up rather than tear down, to find his identity in the good he could do rather than the attention he could attract. 1 year after the Chicago bus incident, the 3 men whose lives had been forever intertwined by that fateful encounter found themselves together again. But this time the setting was far different from a crowded city bus. They stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, having been invited to a ceremony honoring everyday heroes who'd made extraordinary impacts in their communities. Jake Anderson, now 73, stood straighter than he had in years. The past 12 months had transformed him from an invisible veteran into a national advocate for homeless and forgotten service members. His speeches had inspired legislation providing better mental health support for veterans, and his story had become a rallying point for a new generation of Americans who wanted to honor their military heritage. Today he wore his dress uniform from Vietnam, the medals finally meaning something again after decades of feeling worthless. Beside him, Steven Seagal maintained his characteristic quiet dignity, uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding its importance. He'd reluctantly accepted a role as spokesman for a national anti-bullying campaign, using his platform to teach young people about the difference between strength and aggression. His martial arts schools now offered free classes to veterans dealing with PTSD, combining physical training with emotional healing. Marcus Rivera, 23 now and visibly changed from the angry young man who'd boarded that bus, stood with them wearing a simple suit and a small pin representing his Bridges program. In the past year, his organization had housed over 300 veterans and connected thousands of young people with meaningful volunteer opportunities. He'd been featured on the cover of Time magazine's Heroes of Change issue, but unlike his previous viral fame, this recognition felt substantial and earned. President Martinez stepped forward to address the crowd of reporters, dignitaries, and families who'd gathered for the ceremony. We're here today to honor 3 men who remind us that heroism isn't always found on battlefields or in movie scripts. Sometimes it's found on a city bus, when one person decides that dignity matters more than safety, when another person chooses to document injustice rather than ignore it, and when a third person discovers that true strength comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. The president turned to Jake first. Sergeant Anderson, your service in Vietnam was just the beginning of your service to this country. Your willingness to share your story, to advocate for your fellow veterans, and to forgive someone who wronged You has inspired millions of Americans to remember that our veterans deserve our respect, our support, and our action, not just our gratitude. Jake accepted the Presidential Medal of Freedom with trembling hands, thinking of Mike Desmond and all the brothers who hadn't lived to see this moment of recognition. In his acceptance speech, he dedicated the award to the forgotten veterans, still living on America's streets, still fighting battles that their country preferred not to acknowledge. "This medal doesn't belong to me," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly across the garden. "It belongs to every veteran who came home to silence instead of celebration, who fought invisible wars with invisible wounds, who served their country with honor, and then served their communities with quiet dignity. We were never fighting for medals or recognition. We were fighting for each other, and for the idea that everyone deserves to be treated with respect." Steven Seagal's recognition was for his work in youth development and anti-violence programs. As he accepted his award, he spoke briefly about the responsibility that comes with strength, whether physical, financial, or social. "Real power isn't about what you can do to others," Seagal said. "It's about what you choose to do for others. Every person in this room has the power to stand up for someone who needs defending, to speak up for someone whose voice isn't being heard, to step forward when others step back. That's not heroism. That's just being human." When Marcus's turn came, the audience included several of the teenagers who'd attended his school presentations over the past year. His award recognized not just his transformation, but his work in helping other young people find purpose beyond social media fame. "A year ago, I was the villain in this story," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "I built my identity around causing pain, around turning others people's suffering into my entertainment. I thought strength meant making others feel small, that success meant stepping on people to climb higher." He paused, looking toward Jake and Steven. "These men could have written me off as irredeemable. Mr. Anderson could have pressed charges, demanded revenge. Mr. Seagal could have humiliated me the way I'd humiliated others. Instead, they showed me what real strength looks like, the strength to forgive, to protect, to believe that people can change if they're willing to do the work." Marcus's voice broke slightly as he continued. "This award doesn't erase what I did. It doesn't make me a hero, but it represents the possibility that exists in everyone to choose who they want to become, regardless of who they've been. If someone like me can find a path to redemption, then there's hope for anyone willing to take that first step." After the ceremony, the three men walked together through the White House gardens, accompanied by Erica Mendoza, who'd been recognized for her role in documenting and sharing the story that had changed so many lives. Her video had ultimately been viewed over 200 million times across all platforms, sparking a global conversation about respect, dignity, and the power of bearing witness to injustice. "Did you ever think it would lead to this?" Erica asked, gesturing toward the iconic building behind them. "I just wanted to get to Mike's funeral," Jake replied with a smile. "Funny how life works out sometimes." Steven nodded thoughtfully. "The incident lasted maybe 10 minutes, but the choices we made in those 10 minutes, Jake's dignity under pressure, your decision to document it, Marcus's willingness to change, those choices are still rippling outward." "What's next?" Marcus asked. He'd become something of a surrogate son to both older men, their weekly dinners a highlight of his rehabilitation and growth. "The work continues," Jake said simply. "Veterans are still homeless. Young people are still lost. Bullies are still hurting innocent people. We've gotten some attention, some resources, some support. Now we use those tools to keep building." As they parted ways that evening, each returning to their respective cities and ongoing work, they carried with them the knowledge that their unlikely bond had become something larger than friendship. They'd become symbols of the possibility for redemption, the power of forgiveness, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. The Chicago bus incident would be studied in psychology classes, featured in documentaries, and referenced in countless discussions about online behavior and social responsibility. But for the three men who'd lived it, its greatest legacy wasn't fame or recognition. It was the daily choice to use their experience to make the world a little better, one interaction at a time. Marcus returned to Chicago and continued expanding the Bridges program, eventually taking it national. Jake became a sought-after speaker whose advocacy led to significant improvements in veteran care and support. Steven Seagal quietly returned to his work training young people in discipline, respect, and the responsible use of strength. Years later, when reporters asked them about the lasting impact of that day, their answers were remarkably similar. It wasn't about going viral or becoming famous, but about remembering that every person we encounter carries a story worth respecting, that every moment offers a choice between kindness and cruelty, and that the smallest acts of courage can change everything. On busy city buses across America, passengers now sometimes recognize each other's humanity a little more clearly, speak up a little more quickly when someone needs defending, and remember that the most powerful force in any situation isn't anger or aggression, but the simple decision to treat each other with dignity. The legacy lived on in countless small moments that would never be filmed or shared or celebrated, but that made the world incrementally better, because 3 strangers on a Chicago bus had shown what was possible when people chose courage over comfort, compassion over indifference, and hope over despair. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.